At some point, a demographist-focused YouTube channel just got to do the South Korean population collapse video, right? I have wanted to do a South Korean demographic video for a long time, but I was sort of hesitant, since there is a lot of content about this issue on YouTube. However, then I just thought that I will do what I want, so here we are. Now, to somehow start, you can't imagine how much time I have spent just looking randomly at the South Korean population pyramid. In some strange way, I found it almost hauntingly beautiful. But it is also a graphic visualization of a national tragedy in the making. South Korea is well known for being the country with the lowest fertility rate on the planet, with 0.72 children per woman in 2023. Now, such levels of fertility rate are really, without any bombastic sensationalism, a nation killer. Based on the calculations, if such a fertility rate would stay constant for a century, the number of births in South Korea could decline by 88 to 94%. Obviously, it remains unknown if South Korea's fertility rate will stay at such ultra-low levels. I personally do not think it will, but it is essential to visualize the decline in population that such levels of fertility mean. That really is dire. The difference between a country with a fertility rate of 1.3 children per woman, something already considered ultra-low fertility, and South Korea, is now almost 0.6 children per woman, which is a huge difference. Same as between a country with a healthy fertility rate of 2 and ultra-low fertility of 1.4 children per woman. Now, there is a lot to unpack here. The ultra-competitive nature of Korean society, the long working hours, the relatively traditional approach to gender roles, and the somewhat cranky gender relations in Korea, the specific nature of East Asian metropolitan housing market, the preference for male offspring, and so much more. But I feel like all these are just symptoms of one big overreaching illness that causes most of this to happen. Let's find out what it is. Most of you are likely familiar with the term evolutionary mismatch. It is the evolutionary concept describing a previously advantageous trait that might become maladaptive due to change in the environment, especially when change is rapid. An example might be current high levels of obesity and diabetes, where our genetically ingrained urge to eat as many calories as possible so we can store enough fat to live off when food is scarce is turned against us in an environment where food is anything but scarce and we sit for most of our days. Now, I do not want to necessarily speak about genetics or evolution in this video, but I think the concept is very useful when explaining the reasons for the remarkably disastrous state of South Korean and broadly East Asian demographics. Apart from a classic evolutionary selection process that is genetic, there is also a cultural evolution. We all have certain cultural programming that largely influences what we perceive as just, desirable, and generally right in life. This programming stems from a plethora of sources, such as the traditional family systems in different pre-modern societies, different religious traditions, or even different climate and geographic conditions. This cultural programming very significantly influences how we perceive relations between men and women, parents and children, siblings, marriage and childbearing, authority, social and economic egalitarianism, collectivism versus individualism, other nations and ethnic groups, and so on. Unless we have a direct comparison with different cultures, we likely often do not even notice these culturally determined predispositions, since we just consider them to be completely normal. In the past 200 years, approximately from the Industrial Revolution onward, the environment in which these pre-industrial cultural norms have been created was gradually ripped apart by the tide of modernity. Societies that have reached some level of urbanization, industrialization, and education increasingly resemble each other in many ways. While in pre-modern times, a massive level of diversity existed between various fabulous architectural styles across different cultures, today, most new buildings look very similar, whether you are in Seoul, Istanbul, or Vancouver. And family relations have been remarkably homogenized as well. Before, great diversity of traditions existed. People lived in nuclear families, in STEM families where the grandparents and the eldest married son and his children lived together under the authority of the grandfather, large clannish communitarian families where all the married sons and their families lived under the authority of the patriarchal grandfather, and countless mixes and variations of these family arrangements. Today, from Moscow to Los Angeles and from Bangkok to Buenos Aires, nuclear families are the norm, with other arrangements surviving mostly in rural or underdeveloped regions. While the position of women greatly differed between different civilizations, women today are expected to study and work in almost all somewhat developed areas, with the exception of Muslim countries, although female labor participation is growing there as well. But our cultural programming has not been completely overwritten by these rapid changes. We still keep many of the previously ingrained worldviews, and they still influence how we act and perceive our lives. Around the world, even developed societies display significant diversity in reproductive behavior. Fertility rate, levels of childlessness, age at first birth and at marriage, births out of wedlock, and so on. The clash of the old cultural programming with the civilizational modernity in some cultures is clearly much more harmful to fertility rates than it is in others. The cultural evolutionary mismatch is largely universal, but its severity greatly differs. In South Korea, it has reached the highest possible level. I will now go over a number of specific examples to showcase what I mean by this. First of all, it is generally estimated that the population of East Asia, including South Korea, has experienced less turbulent changes throughout its history than was common in Europe, for example. The populations were more stable, growing more modestly, but experiencing fewer periods of rapid decline. This likely means that the region's inhabitants managed to identify the population size that its agricultural system based on irrigation and rice cultivation could sustain, and implemented cultural self-restraining mechanisms not to breach this Malthusian ceiling, including relatively widespread infanticide. The practice of infanticide was historically very prevalent in all East Asian cultures as a way to prevent overpopulation and, thus, Malthusian catastrophes in the form of famines and pandemics that caused depopulation and misery. All cultures throughout history somehow struggled with these population limitations in the pre-modern period era, when sources, most notably food, were very scarce. But while in the Abrahamic religious traditions of the West, every life was considered sacred, infanticide was unacceptable, and the regulation of population numbers was usually performed through tightened sexual morality and postponement in the age of marriage and thus childbearing, in East Asian cultures, which never embraced the sanctity of every human life as an unbreachable religious concept, infanticide was a commonplace way of dealing with children that their family or the broader community would not be able to feed. The Confucian cultural core of South Korean society emphasizes the values of self-reliance, self-cultivation and self-control, and collectivistic emphasis on the harmony of the whole community and the responsibility of the individual to not act against this harmony. For example, by having more children than one could feed without negatively affecting the community. Confucianism has been pervasive in every aspect of Korean life. It centers the family as the fundamental unit of society and determines hierarchical social relations. Men are given higher status in Confucian societies as the head of the household and bear the responsibility for the entire family. Women are said to follow three people in their lives: their fathers, their husbands, and their sons. South Korea traditionally had a patrilineal stem family type, where primogeniture was applied, so the eldest son in the family resided with the parents, took care of them in the old age, and then inherited the family property. Only the father's lineage was relevant for the children, and women's position was low compared to many other societies, most notably the West. I said that the son took care of his parents, but in reality, the care of the husband's parents was performed by his wife, so their daughter-in-law. For the other sons, the groom's family would traditionally get a new home when they were about to get married. There was also a limited level of polygamy among high-status men, mostly noblemen, who could take a secondary wife. Secondary wives were subordinate to the primary wife, and children from the second marriage were not part of the father's lineage, which is so important in Confucian hierarchical family structure. Confucianism also instilled in Korea the rigid, competitive, exam-based academic culture. Confucianism stresses merit as the basis for judging individuals and awarding status. More than that, status is conferred to the entire family, not only to an individual. So, if you succeed in your life, your whole family will cherish you. But if you fail, you will bring shame to your whole family and your lineage. No pressure, bro. Shame plays a large role in Korean culture when control is executed by the inculcation of shame and the complementary threat of ostracism. So, you do not want to be the one breaching the established cultural norms. The patrilineality of the Korean family system is also expressed in a strong preference for male offspring. The family needed a son to become the head of the household after his father, since the daughters were married away to become subservient to other men. The mentioned infanticides were thus always very much centered on getting rid of female offspring. The other major philosophical or religious tradition present in Korea for millennia is Buddhism. However, Buddhism is quite distinct from the major Abrahamic religions because of its lack of explicitly pro-natalist ideas. While in countries where Abrahamic religious traditions such as Christianity, Islam, or Judaism were historically dominant, there is a correlation between religiosity and fertility. More religious people have larger families. Such correlation does not exist in Buddhist countries. While Christianity made significant progress in South Korea throughout the 20th century, the South Korean Christians do not have a meaningfully higher fertility rate than other groups in Korean society. Thus, Christianity could not override the cultural programming of the previous millennia, which is understandable due to the short exposure of Korean society to Christianity. Let's look at what happened in South Korea in the past 70 years or so. The country underwent a massive, turbocharged, highly condensed development. Societal processes that took centuries in Europe or the United States happened within a few decades. The urban population of South Korea increased from 28% to 80% in just 40 years, between 1960 and 2000. The literacy rate went from 22% in 1945 to 87% in 1970, and now South Korea is among the countries with the absolute highest percentage of people with college education. That was accompanied by some of the highest economic growths ever seen anywhere. The cultural traits described above allowed South Korea to be remarkably economically successful. But now, these same cultural traits are turning against South Koreans, making them go extinct. Cultural evolution just can't keep pace with such incredibly rapid development. South Koreans remarkably quickly abandoned the habit of having large families when the economic boom started and the population began to urbanize. The fertility rate decreased from 6 children per woman to under 2 in just 24 years, one of the fastest declines ever seen. Since the deep cultural traditions were not all that pro-natalist in the first place, the fertility decline was not moderated by any significant cultural barriers, as in the case of Abrahamic countries, where the declines were usually much more gradual. That created a splendid demographic dividend for South Korea. Since the number of children rapidly declined, and the elderly population was also very low, the percentage of people in productive age increased from 53 to 72% between 1965 and the 1990s, and it stayed at this peak level until 2015. Economists estimate that these highly favorable demographic trends account for a third of the economic growth in South Korea in this period. But the fertility decline never stopped. Now, let's go over the cultural traits described in the previous chapter and examine how they might affect demographics. As already said, the basic cultural programming of the South Korean population is not overtly pro-natalist. The population has a tradition of limiting population growth, so as not to overstretch its resources. It is better to put more resources into fewer offspring to ensure their success in the harsh competition than to have many with limited resources for their nurture. While in many Western and almost all more developed Muslim countries or Israel, you will often find some small fraction of the population that is highly religious and has very high fertility, without that much consideration for economic factors, that is not the case in South Korea. The ultra-competitive academic culture and the fact that the status of their offspring influences the whole family leads to an incredibly demanding educational environment, where children and young people spend a massive amount of time either in school or in after-school education with private tutors, and the parents, most likely the mother, spend a huge amount of time helping the kids arrange and attend all these after-school activities. And it, of course, costs a lot of money. Spending on private education reached a record high of $20.6 billion in South Korea in 2023. The share of household expenditures on education was 14% in Korea, compared with 3% in the United States. So, it is pretty hard to pull this off with more kids. The costs of raising a kid are just objectively higher than elsewhere. The shame-based culture makes the social costs of not succeeding, either as a kid in school or as a parent unable to pay for all the educational expenses, really high. The work culture is likewise very demanding and competitive. People work very long hours and often have to attend after-work dinners with their boss and colleagues, full of drinking and karaoke. Not attending these parties might be seen as not listening to one's social superior and thus frowned upon, even though this culture is gradually changing. Then there is the status of women. South Korea is a typical example of a country where women's traditional, deeply ingrained position becomes explosive in contact with modernity. Women are expected to study and work remarkably hard, same as men. But if they want to have children, it is tough to combine it with motherhood. The workplace is very family unfriendly, and the social norms still perceive women's primary role as being a mother. In 2012, only 20% of mothers in South Korea took maternity leave, while in France, this proportion is close to 100%. The majority of soon-to-be mothers just leave work. That makes women feel like they have to categorically choose between career and motherhood, which is not good for fertility, if these women just underwent a decade of crazy studying to prepare for the mentioned career. The traditionally subservient position of women towards their husbands, or the habit of responsibility of the wife to take care of the husband's parents along with their own, while spending massive amounts of time supporting her children in their education, might further disincentivize marriage and motherhood for women. To showcase the prevalence of pre-modern cultural norms in Korea in regards to gender relations, the law that prohibited the practice of a married woman being transferred from being her father's dependent to her husband's dependent, with the husband's signature required for all legal paperwork and all aspects of daily life, was abolished on January 1st, 2008. Children were also registered only under the father's name in this system. The law prohibiting people with the same surname from marrying, part of the Korean very strict incest taboo, was definitely prohibited in 2005. Since in 1990s, 40% of the South Korean population had one of these 5 surnames, Kim, Park, Lee, Choi, and Jung, this ban caused understandable issues. While the patrilineal family system is now legally a thing of the past, it is still pervasive in the corporate structures of the large Korean conglomerates. Researchers found that 38% of founders' sons had already inherited the founders' positions, and 46% were in the positions to be group chairmen sooner or later when their fathers retired. Shares in vast empires pass from generation to generation using elaborate ownership structures. Moreover, the preference for male offspring, in combination with the technological availability of selective abortion, led to sex ratio at birth reaching its peak of 116 male babies per 100 female babies in the 1990s. That means that there are huge male surpluses in the age brackets relevant for childbearing, and the incel situation in South Korea is thus also very problematic. In my previous video, I talked about the practice of men in rural areas in many Western countries, importing foreign wives due to the lack of women in these areas. This practice is even more pronounced in South Korea, where 1 in 10 new marriages include a foreign spouse, with this figure reaching 1 in 3 in rural areas, from where women migrate to cities more rapidly than men do. Most often, this means Korean men bringing in wives from China, Vietnam, or the Philippines. Many of these marriages, nevertheless, end in divorce in a relatively short time. The sex ratios at birth have since then mostly normalized due to cultural changes and interventions by the state, but the impacts of these practices still linger. Korean weddings are usually very costly affairs for the involved families. Even though these traditions are gradually fading away, there still is the habit of the investment in a home for the newlyweds. Wedding expenses include gifts between the families and hosting hundreds of guests, many of whom may only know the parents of the bride or groom. However, the wedding guest list itself represents the status of the family. In a recent survey, 76% of Koreans reported that wedding expenses and procedures were excessive. However, having children out of wedlock is basically not an option for Koreans. Only 4% of new births in 2022 were out of wedlock, and that is an increase since the figure was usually as low as 2%. For comparison, in Western countries, out of wedlock births often comprise between 40 and 50% of births. The social disdain for mothers who do have children without marriage remains high, likely due to the old patrilineal traditions of illegitimate children being excluded from the father's lineage, as well as the stigma that might connect cohabitation with the aforementioned secondary wives, which were subordinated to the primary wife, and whose children were as well excluded from the lineage. Another factor contributing to the very low number of children out of wedlock is the rise of Christianity in Korea, since Christianity also does not support births outside marriage. So, if the wedding is seen as a sort of overtly costly and taxing affair, but having children without marriage is very unpopular as well, then the results for fertility are once again clearly negative. The cultural tradition of tight-knit, multi-generational families that are highly supportive of their members also translates into lower state support for both families and elderly people, which further reinforces these negative demographic patterns. South Korea is one of the few countries where suicide rates exponentially increase with age. The suicide rate for Koreans aged 75 and older was 160 per 100,000 persons. The OECD average for that age group is 19. These suicides are most prevalent among rural elderly, who did not benefit as much from the booming metropolitan economy and whose children have long ago left for the cities, and they thus do not have the support from their families that they would traditionally get. Since these people often receive very meager pensions, many of them deal with their precarious situation by suicide. Once again, the cultural emphasis on self-reliance and the shame stemming from being a burden to one's family or community plays a significant role in these decisions. That is what I meant when I talked about evolutionary mismatch. While the deep cultural roots of South Korean society were remarkably effective in their economic ascension, they are profoundly self-damaging in the context of modern, urbanized, highly technologically advanced society when it comes to demographics. All the incentives are, in practice, antinatalist. Since the societal changes happened remarkably fast in South Korea, these cultural norms were not abandoned, and there wasn't enough time for them to undergo cultural evolution. And, even though people overwhelmingly live in nuclear families, in urban apartments, and women study and work, many social relations are still underpinned by habits from times when patrilineal multi-generational families were the cornerstones of a deeply kinship-based rural environment. While the government is massively expanding pro-family policies in recent decades, the spending is still merely half of the OECD average, and it is to absolutely no avail. And I do not mean this as some attack on traditions and an argument for unconditional progress. Precisely in times when social change is so rapid, people long for some form of cultural anchor the most. I completely understand this. Some traditions serve their purpose in every era and should be preserved. But some cultural norms do not make much sense when applied to drastically different environments than for which they were initially developed. It is also foolish to think that all that is needed is to copy family policy from some Western country with relatively higher fertility, such as France, and the reproductive behavior of Koreans would increase. That is not how it works. Fertility is relatively higher in certain Western countries, precisely because of their old cultural programming, with the relatively higher position of women, the old tradition of nuclear families, and individualism, which is much more in sync with modernity. Now, there, of course, are all the other factors contributing to the remarkably low fertility among contemporary young people everywhere: housing affordability, polarization in gender relations, the rapidly worsening mental health of young people, and so on. But, as I said, these factors are common for almost every country. When you talk to young people from literally everywhere, Canada, America, Western or Eastern Europe, Turkey or South Korea, they will all tell you the housing is so unaffordable that they just cannot afford to have a family. And yet, the fertility rates wildly differ. They are low everywhere, but 1.4 children per woman is still double of 0.7, the South Korean level. The remarkably low level in South Korea points to deeper cultural causes. I do not think there is much to be done about it. Things must run their course, and new cultural norms must gradually develop.